Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to see all of you are here. Okay, we got the projector working. I don't know why it wasn't working, but it's working now. I think this angle is better for the camera as well.
I
What?
just got notification
Well, that we're live.
to watch you live.
Yes. Actually, I didn't send this before, so I left the link It's not a locked link, but maybe we'll change it afterwards. Okay, so for all those who are here and not here, sweating. Okay, who said they were cold? I'm literally dripping sweat. That's because I was rushing. You're freezing. Have a tea. Maybe we'll turn up the ears. Okay, when I turn on the video, I'll raise the air. We'll start with a joke, and then we're going to get to a very interesting video. So today's class is going to be Justice. Shall you pursue standards of evidence in the Talmud? We're going to be talking about confessions and incentivized witnesses. That'll be the two things we'll be talking about today. They very much connected. So the joke is about the Russians during the Cold War, and they capture a German, a Englishman, and an Italian. And the Russians get them all tied up. They're tied to some torture, desk or whatever. And they start to interrogate the British guy. Within 10 minutes, he confesses to whatever it is that they want him to confess to. Whatever you say, he confesses 10 minutes. The German, he's a little bit more tough stuff. They tie him up. They start to torture him. They're hitting him. They're whipping him. Whatever they're doing to him, they're torturing him. After an hour, he breaks. He confesses to whatever it is they want him to confess to. They take the Italian. They tie him up. They start to beat him, to hit him, to torture him. 1 hour goes by. 2 hours go by. 3 hours go by. They can't break him. After hours and hours of all of different kinds of torture, eventually they give up. They say, "You can go free. We couldn't get a confession." As he's leaving, the British guy and the German guy said to him, "How did you hold strong and not confess after so many hours?" And the Italian says, "How could I confess? My hands were tied." Yes, okay, talk with the hands. Okay, I'm going to turn off the lights and we shall watch a fascinating video. Oopsies, let me first go turn. We're going to turn off the lights and we're going to turn this. That would be cool. But I'm going to do it like this maybe. 1 second. 1 second, don't mind this. See if that works. Let me turn the lights off. The front are still on. Okay, we're going through the front. I think I'm going to start.
Trying to get a connection.
The Avery family owns a sprawling auto salvage business in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. But in October 2005, something sinister was found among the wrecked cars. The partially concealed vehicle of a missing person. Teresa Hallbach, a 25-year-old photographer from nearby Calumet County, had vanished without a trace. Detectives attempting to trace her footsteps began where she had left off. Her last appointment was with a man named Stephen Avery at his family salvage yard. She had driven there to photograph a minivan for sale. Forensic evidence links Stephen to Teresa's murder, but he denied the charges.
I'd have to say I didn't do it. Well, if I did it, why would I stick around if I'm guilty? I won't. I'd be running.
He even had an alibi. He had spent part of the time in which he was accused of murdering Teresa with his 16-year-old nephew and neighbor, Brendan Dassey. Instead of an alibi, that information turned out to be a promising lead. The Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department had the teenager questioned. He confessed in detail to aiding his uncle Stephen in the rape and murder of Teresa and the mutilation of her corpse.
And we put her on the floor and then he shot her 10 times. And he threw her in the fire.
Stephen stood trial in neighboring Calumet County in March 2007.
At this time, the court will read the verdicts. We, the jury, find the defendant, Stephen A. Avery, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
He was sentenced to life behind bars without parole for the first-degree murder of Teresa Hallbach. The following month, his nephew Brendan Dassey, 17 by then, was tried as an adult and sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, rape, and mutilation.
As to count one, we, the jury, find the defendant Brendan R. Dassey guilty of first-degree intentional.
But the case proved to be highly controversial. Dassey's confession had played an important role in the convictions, but it also set off a rumble of disturbing questions, which, in the following years, swelled into a roar that was unleashed worldwide through a popular 2015 Netflix series. At trial, Brendan Dassey recanted his confessions, claiming that he was coerced. His defense argued that he had an IQ in the borderline deficiency range, and that psychological testing showed him as highly suggestible, making him extremely likely to following his interrogator's lead, regardless of the truth. Officers repeatedly told Brendan that they knew he had participated in the crime, although they actually had no evidence for such a claim.
We pretty much know everything. That's why we're talking to you again today. What was it?
We have the evidence, Brendan. We just need you to be honest with us. We know, we just need you to tell us.
At one point, an officer told young Brendan they were just there to help him.
Yeah, I understand. Our investigators and stuff like that, but I'm not letting know. My father would have to kill your age too. You got money. I got hard, and I always get the heart, and then I heard.
And in many instances, the questions appear to have guided and prodded Brendan to provide the answers the investigators wanted to hear.
What else did he do where we know something else was done? Tell us. Well, what else did you do? Come on. Something with the head.
They cut off her hair.
Okay, what else?
What else was done to her head?
That he punched her.
What did he do, Brendan?
Cut her
Cut her where?
on the throat.
What else happens to her in her head?
We know, we just need you to tell us.
That's all I can remember.
All right, I'm just gonna come out and ask you. Who shot her in the head?
He did.
Why didn't you tell us that?
Because I couldn't think of it.
In the years that followed, the case climbed unsteadily through the courts.
A real-life plot twist. A federal judge overturns the conviction of Brendan Dassey, subject of the popular Netflix documentary series, Making a Murderer, ruling his confession was involuntary. Now, after 9 years of incarceration, he may finally go free.
But in December 2017, the Seventh Circuit ruled that the confession was valid, and they upheld his conviction.
Brendan Dassey won 2 court battles before this new ruling, which could keep him in prison for the rest of his life. That federal appeals court finding he was not intimidated or coerced into confessing to rape and murder.
The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal. What began as a grisly murder of a photographer has since swollen into a global dialogue on coerced confessions and their aftermaths.
Okay, so I'm back. Powerful story. I know that this story is very, very popular because of the Netflix series, right? Making a Murderer. Even though when you research the story a little bit, you find that it's not necessarily so black and white. But there's many, many other stories like that. For example, the Norfolk 4, which is also there's many stories like this where people have confessed to crimes that later was proven. So here it wasn't proven. Here it's still ongoing thing. Okay, so the Norfolk 4, if anyone's familiar with the Norfolk 4? It's a whole long story. But the point is that there was this lady that was also raped and murdered. Her name was Michelle Bosco. And when her husband came home, he found her had been raped, stabbed, and strangled to death. And the detectives were suspicious of two people in the complex where they lived. A guy called Williams, Daniel Williams, and a guy called Joe Dick. And they interrogated together and separately. And they ended up getting each one to confess to different things, completely contradictory confessions. Williams claimed that he acted alone. Dick stated he acted together with Williams. But then the DNA didn't match. There were obvious problems with either of them being the criminal. So then they had to, they had DNA from the crime scene. And neither of the two people that they were trying to say was guilty was their DNA at the scene. So they were trying to find more witnesses. So then they got a jail snitch to get them to accuse other people. So they accused a third person and a fourth person. Their DNA didn't match. They ended up accusing another three people that they were never able to charge. And in the end, years later, in January of 1998, there was a person called Omer Ballard who pleaded guilty to the rape of a 14-year-old girl, and his DNA matched the crime scene. He had no connection to any of these people. He confessed to the crime, and he said that he did it alone. His confession was he did it himself. They had the DNA. And yet the police refused to allow that to ruin their already previously held convictions. So the police incorporated his testimony into the crime, and they said that he wasn't labeling the accomplices that they already had convicted because they didn't want to be accused of being a snitch, even though, whatever. In the end, there was trials, and eventually in 2017, the governor of Virginia gave them all, he gave three, one of them finished a sentence, but the other ones were all given a pardon. Whatever. Many stories like that. So, why are confessions so valuable in the Jewish judicial system? First and foremost, because they're the best kind of evidence, right? It would seem that if someone's confessing to a crime, that's the best evidence you can ask for. Why would someone confess to a crime they didn't do? So if someone says, I did it, what else do you want? What?
You might confess and didn't need something. Maybe you confess for a different reason. There are special ways that people might confess. They might think the lawyer's so great that he'll be proven innocent anyway, or if he confesses, really.
Yeah, but why would you, if you think that the law will prove you innocent, why would you? Let's not get into the details yet, but generally speaking, you would assume that if someone says, I did it, it's usually a good reason to assume that they actually did it. Why would they lie, confess to a crime that they didn't commit? Number two, because criminals often act on their own, so sometimes the only way to solve a crime is by a confession, because you won't have any witnesses to the crime. You won't have any other good evidence of the crime. And thirdly, when you have a plea bargain, it saves the state a lot of resources necessary to conduct a lengthy trial and to get all the evidence and to go through the whole process. Slows up the court system. They make a plea bargain, done, they pleaded guilty, they confess to the crime, we move on, and it saves everyone a lot of work. For these reasons, confessions have almost universally been considered an integral part of any country's judicial system. From ancient Greece, and Rome, and China, and Japan, and throughout the medieval era, coming all times, the queen of evidence was a confession. But, precisely because confessions are so valuable, therefore they became so vulnerable to abuse. And one of the very effective ways that prosecutors or police, etc., found of getting these confessions, whether or not they had the right guy, was torture. Torture gets people to confess to anything you want them to confess to. And the use of torture was basically endemic in almost every judicial system from the ancient eras and the medieval periods. The worst was during the Catholic Church and the Inquisition. In the 1400s, the 13, 14, 1500s was the Spanish Inquisition that tortured, the Jews suffered a lot, that's why we're very familiar with the stories. But it wasn't limited. The use of torture in the Church Inquisition wasn't limited exclusively to Jews, unfortunately. And the officially sanctioned practice of torture to obtain confessions continued all the way up until the 18th century. When Western civilization finally began to recognize the moral repugnancy, so that they had the unethical implications of torturing someone to confess, and they began to put in safeguards to prevent tortured confessions, until in the United States we have the Fifth Amendment, which only came later, but we have the Fifth Amendment, which gave this criminal the right to decline to answer any question that may be self-incriminating. The landmark case of Miranda versus Arizona, where basically a criminal suspect must be informed of what we call the Miranda rights before they are questioned or interrogated, to be given the Miranda warning of their Miranda rights. Okay? This is the history of confessions with torture. Now, besides for the moral and ethical problems of using torture to obtain confessions, there's also a technical problem. When you're using torture to obtain confession, it's very hard to know how legitimate or how accurate or authentic that confession really is. Besides for the moral issues involved. When you're torturing someone and they say, yes, I did the crime, it's hard to tell. That's not really proof that they really did it. It just means that they don't like being tortured. Like most of us don't enjoy, you'd rather confess to anything to stop the torture. And while the Fifth Amendment today protects against physical torture, there's many other forms of, not to use the word torture is a strong word, but coercion and force that is still used because of the value that confessions have in the legal system, even till today. And there's many interrogative methods that are used to manipulate and to pressure the suspects into confessing. The most famous and controversial method is the Reed technique, which is basically where the police falsely tell the suspect that we already know all the evidence and we already know that you're guilty, we have your DNA, etc. Just confess to make it easy for you. Like you saw in the video, they're telling him, we already know. We just want you to validate for us, and then we'll be nice to you, and we're here to help you and to hug you, and we're just trying to make it easier for you by giving you the chance to confirm to us what we already know. Straight up lying, it's manipulation. That's how Brendan Dassey was interrogated with this technique. And although some courts found it unconstitutional, the Seventh Court of Appeals did not find it as a coercion to, I forgot to do all this stuff. The Seventh Court of Appeals found that Dassey's confession was voluntary. There was no physical coercion or intimidation, and his confession stands. And this guy is still sitting in jail till today. Now, obviously, many disagree with that, and they argue that when you're using psychological coercion, especially on the 17-year-old who has a very, very low IQ, who's very, very susceptible to being convinced and to being manipulated to saying what it is you want them to say, although, yes, it's true, no one was beating him or putting him on the torture rack or twisting his arm, but the psychological coercion and manipulation is a form of coercion and force regardless. So, the question I'm going to put to you, and then I'll open the floor, is, in your opinion, should Brendan Dassey's confession to the rape and murder of Teresa Halbach be considered a voluntary, valid confession made without coercion? Neil, yes, let's start with you.
There's not enough information here. Usually, it's been shown to be legal, you're allowed to lie to suspects.
Oh, it's legal. The Reed technique is legal. It's controversial.
So here's what you want to do. First of all, there's enough detail, and this is why when a crime like this happens, you prevent it from getting media coverage. You prevent it from releasing a lot of the facts of how the person was murdered, maybe dismemberment, all these kind of things. So now it's not just that the person you're saying, hey, listen, tell us, what you did, and they kind of suggested something that they shouldn't have. What do you do to the head? But specifically, if there were things done, like you cut an X into the forehead and stuff like that, that's what you're trying to draw out of the suspect, something that only the killer or killers would know and could give you.
Right, so in that confession, after he couldn't say that they shot her in the head, so they said, who shot in the head?
He brought up, like I said, I don't know much about the case, but he did say that her throat was cut.
It wasn't cut. It wasn't cut.
Okay. I don't know enough about the case.
It wasn't cut. And that's why they said, the fact, exactly what you're saying is exactly what happened in the case. The police did not reveal all the facts, and the fact that she had been shot had not been made public. So in the confession, it was very important to get him to confess to the shooting in order to validate that he knew information that had not yet been made public. So they were trying to get out of him that they had shot her. You see the video, you see the interrogation. That's why it's a great case, because you have the video. And he couldn't, when they asked him, so why didn't you tell us that he shot her? But he responds, I couldn't think of it. I didn't remember. I couldn't think of what does he want me to say to you. He was making up things to try and say to them. They did not cut her hair.
About the 10 times.
What?
Was she shot 10 times? Because he said, and they didn't say anything other, we already know, tell us what happened. She was shot 10 times. Was she shot 10 times?
I don't know if she was out 10 times. Didn't say that.
He said that in the video.
Oh.
So that's why.
Yeah, he gave specific.
But they were feeding him.
But I mean, I didn't see them feeding for that stuff. I mean, cutting her hair.
Yeah, but that's not what happened. The shooting in the head. They fed him that information and said who shot her in the head.
Right.
They're feeding him.
But before that, there were other stuff that, and I assumed, that it was corroborated, but if it wasn't, it wasn't.
Oh, thank you. Now I will admit I did research the case a little bit. This case is not an open, clear-cut case of something that was done incorrectly. Just as good for the video because you have the video of the confession. Yes. Mark and then another Mark. Well, first, Mark and then.
Judging what I saw, I have two ways that it could be improved to get it correct. Number one, there should be at least 1 or 2 ways.
Okay.
I mean, you can't take somebody of a mental capacity like that. And number two, he should have been taken exactly over to the site. He should have been shown like 5 different knives.
Which one?
Knives
Yes.
did you use to do it? 2 or 3 different guns. Which gun was used to shoot the suspect? You take him over to the site, not in a jail cell where they're telling him what to say, and all he's thinking about is how he's going to get the hell out of there and get his next meal, right? So you have him corroborate the scene and exactly what happened by bringing him to the scene.
Okay.
And show him 3 dead bodies in the morgue and make him identify which body was the dead body. I mean, so at least you can have a confession that is a little bit more corroborated by the evidence that he's presenting.
Right. Yes.
My question is on confession, which
Do next, my
is
faith.
very unreliable. In
I'll
fact,
do
this
next.
kid reminds me of the 4th child from the Passover Seder.
Do not ask a question. Yes.
Yeah, and people putting in his mind, and it's a question of interrogation method confession versus the spontaneous confession. Which does the Jewish tradition is acceptable? Here, because
We're going to discuss that, by the way.
here, because it's interrogation, it can be manipulated. Same time too, Netflix can manipulate it too, through careful editing and censoring as well. So
Absolutely.
I don't buy their view as being.
Okay, but the case of the Norfolk 4, that's why I brought it up, because I will admit that when you research this case, it's not clear-cut, absolutely proving that these guys are innocent. The Norfolk 4, they were exonerated. The governor pardoned them because they were clearly they were convicted of confessions where their DNA did not match the crime scene. The stabs of the lady that had been killed, in that case Michelle Bolko, they were all like in one area, which is consistent with one person stabbing multiple times. Not like the prosecution tried to say it was, that each person took turns stabbing her, etc. Here, there's many cases, I'm going to show you some statistics in a second, that there are many cases where confessions are used that are later proven unquestionably to be false confessions. We'll see in a second some statistics, yes.
The corroboration should be independent corroboration. I mean, him corroborating himself is not really corroboration. It's possibly more coercive, something more coercive.
Right.
And that depends on whether you really care. Whether you really care what happened and get to the bottom of it from the point of view of justice, or whether you want to get this case done with and convict somebody and get it over with.
So let me ask you the question. We have a question of discussion. Should the confession that we saw, Brendan Dassey's confession, be considered a useful, legitimate confession to be used in court?
My opinion?
Yeah.
No. Not knowing what we know.
Okay. You say no too. Melanie?
I'm going to say that I don't think for me it doesn't hold water. We have a traumatized, compromised young man who is now, we don't know how long they're there questioning him and saying the same thing over and over and over. And he's a child.
Yeah.
And I know my own kids, okay, yes, okay, yeah, right. Yeah, I was the one who broke the window. Okay?
Okay. Anyone else?
I hate to tell you though, that's how most interrogations are run. The person isn't just willing to go in there and say, yes, I did it, and that's not real life. Real life is, sometimes it takes hours upon hours, and there's certain regulations. You have to offer the person bathroom breaks, you have to get them food. You can't leave them in there for what the court would deem an unreasonable period of time. But that is not unusual. I was a supervisor for the homicide unit and the robbery unit, and that is not an unusual interrogation.
Neil is right. I'm saying Neil is right. What you witnessed is in no way illegal. The interrogation is no way illegal, and the court upheld the interrogation as being valid interrogation. The question was, because of his low IQ, I mean, what they did is, the problem was so much on what the police officers, from a legal perspective, we'll get to the moral, from a legal perspective, it wasn't legally wrong, but questionable maybe, but because he was 17, he wasn't an adult yet, and because he was the psychologist that testified that he's very susceptible to being manipulated, etc. So they're questioning if this particular person is being manipulated by what's happening.
Fair questions.
Right, but does it hold up?
It has.
Well, it has in the court. The Seventh Court of Appeals held it up.
And, they could, whenever they're saying, we're trying to help you, I mean, I had a case today where I'm sitting here, I have the information in front of me, and I'm saying to that guy, I already know, just, I want you to tell me, because I would help him, because if he's gonna sit there and not lie to me, I totally appreciate that more than if he's gonna feed me some stuff.
I gotcha.
So.
Okay, yes, do it. Then we'll get some statistics.
Well, first of all, this case went before a jury.
Yes.
Secondly, the presentation so far has not talked about what other evidence corroborated the confession. What other evidence is there? The jury, so I probably we would have had an attorney to raise these questions, and yet this confession is put out as the only thing that convicted him. What else was there that convinced the jury that this man was guilty?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know what other information they had. I don't think there was any DNA. There's a lot of background to the story about about Stephen Avery, who had been in jail for a different crime, also falsely accused. He was in the middle of a lawsuit against the police department for having put him in prison illegally. And once he was charged with this crime, his $36 million lawsuit settled for $400,000 because he had been convicted of another crime. So there's a lot of backstory to it as well. I don't know. Again, it's not a clear-cut case. It was upheld by the court. The Supreme Court did not want to hear the case. So as of now,
That doesn't mean anything, because the Supreme Court wants to only have a case where they're going to be making law, not to try and
deal with specific issues. I understand that. That's correct. Okay. There's something called the Innocence Project, which has led to the freeing of more than 350 people based on DNA evidence. In a quarter of the cases where they were able to later use DNA to exonerate the people, in more than a quarter of those cases, the person that had been convicted had confessed to the crime. Had confessed or made an incriminating statement. Not only a full-fledged confession, but had made incriminating statements against themselves, which is a lot. Now, this is only from cases where they had DNA evidence that was able to prove that the people that had confessed were innocent. There's obviously many, many, many more cases that we don't have the DNA to be able to prove one way or the other way. If you look on page 93, there's an interesting chart there. Out of 325 cases, 88 of them, the thing had a false confession. 235 had false eyewitnesses, which is already a very well-known thing, that eyewitnesses are very unreliable because our eyes are less accurate than we think. But that's not even what we're discussing today. True, why in Judaism you need to have two witnesses. One is not enough. Okay, so there's definitely a large number, not a majority probably, but a large number of false confessions that are happening. And we're going to talk about that today. Okay? The second thing we're going to talk about is cooperating witnesses. Another very, very widely used and considered very good form of evidence that prosecutors use when they're trying to convict somebody of a crime is an informant, properly known as a cooperating witness, informally known as a snitch. Okay? Usually these informants become state witnesses because they also have some connection to the crime, and they're being promised a lesser sentence or even immunity and condition that they testify against whoever it is a prosecution thinks is a bigger fish that they want to catch. A variation of that is a jailhouse informant. Similar, the jailhouse informant gets these self-incriminating statements, and he's usually rewarded with a sentence reduction or with some kind of benefits like that. Last week, in the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, we talked about an informant who had a key role in the person's conviction and execution. He later admitted that he had lied about that. Okay, so why do we like jailhouse informants and cooperating witnesses? Again, first of all, they're a very, very valuable source of inside information that the prosecution probably would not get otherwise. People are sitting in jail and they confide in their cellmates, or they are bragging about what they've done, and so there's a lot of to be accomplished by that. What's the problem with a cooperating witness or a jailhouse informant? Usually what? Number one, they have their own agenda. But besides that, these people are usually not very honest people. The people that are usually involved and that are in jail have themselves done their own crimes. They've done their own, like the guy we saw last week. I mean, he reeked of, not being an honest person. These are not altruistic whistleblowers that are trying to defend truth and moral right and wrong. They have their own agendas. They want to get their own plea bargains. They want to get their own reductions of sentences, etc. Again, last week's case, so the prosecution denied having promised Johnny Webb, any sentence reduction on behalf of his testimony, but later the prosecutor actually did go before the Texas Parole Board and did get this guy Johnny Webb an early release from prison, and later on they found a handwritten note from the prosecutor to Johnny Webb telling him that they would do that for him. So there's obviously a very, very big bias by these witnesses, and it's very hard to trust these people that, as we already discussed last week, would never stand up as kosher witnesses in the Jewish court of law. Okay? Again, most are probably still true. We don't have any statistic to prove otherwise, but there have been, as the figure shows, over a quarter of cases have been proven to be false convictions were 15%, 48 cases were from informants or snitches that were lying. That's a lot. Out of a small thing. Okay, so that's the second thing we're going to discuss. Consider the Jewish perspective on cooperating witness. Okay? Yes. Sure.
This chart on the screen, you have to compare the figures of the people that DNA proved to be guilty.
No, it was proven guilty, so obviously the confessions were true.
Well, so checking on people who found guilty and using DNA to say, well, these are the numbers that have been found not guilty. DNA doesn't check, doesn't corroborate. Someone else is guilty. How many cases did they check?
The government is not checking. The answer to that is that there is I doubt that there is any kind of such statistics, because no one's going to be paying for that kind of data. The Innocence Project is not a government-funded program where I don't know who's funding it. I shouldn't say where it's funded, but it's not like the government or the prosecutor themselves are going back to check their own, their own authenticity, their own, how good they are. This is an outside organization that feels very, very strong that the judicial system is completely corrupt and that innocent people are being convicted of crimes they didn't do. So this outside organization is trying to exonerate people that have been falsely convicted. In the case that they've been able to prove so far, 350 cases, or in the statistic was 325 cases, of those cases, a quarter of them had part of the conviction was based upon a false confession. 15% was upon a informant, yeah.
But the point is that of those cases, they decided to take this being alleged that the person is really innocent. and they do the DNA, and the DNA shows that the person in fact commits, is guilty, do they publish those?
I don't know. I don't know. Again, if they're found guilty, they're found guilty. What's the...
If they check them, I mean, you're saying that the DNA is proving all these people innocent. Well, has the DNA proved these people, number of people?
Oh, sure. I'm sure that the majority of cases that they do are guilty. I doubt that the majority of cases that are go through the judicial system are innocent people. I highly, highly doubt that. No one is saying that it's all, it's not like the Russian communist, kangaroo courts where they're just taking random people. No one's arguing that. But I don't know exact numbers of how many cases they've tried and how many were innocent and how many, I don't know. Okay, let us begin talking about the Jewish law, the Jewish position on confessions, and then we'll get to cooperating witnesses, okay? You ready? Now, earlier, when I said regarding confessions that they were almost universally plagued by problems of torture, I used the word almost deliberately. Almost universal confessions used, because there is one legal system that has never allowed for any form of confession at all. Not only they don't offer torture confessions, it completely banned confessions from being used as evidence in court, and that is the Jewish legal system. Okay? Now you remember if you learned last week that in order to be able to convict someone of a criminal crime, what do you need in Jewish law? 2 witnesses. And from here we learn that only witnesses can convict a person. A person cannot convict himself. Text number 1. Gary, we'll start with you. Go. Text number 1. Page 94.
There we are. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses.
Text 1b from the Rambam, Maimonides.
It's a scriptural decree that a court cannot execute a person or sentence him to receive corporal punishment on account of a confession, but only based on the testimony of 2 witnesses. Perhaps he is mentally disturbed regarding this matter and therefore confessed in error. Or perhaps he is one of those embittered people who wish for death, who pierce their bellies with swords and throw themselves from the rooftops. We fear that such a person may come and confess to committing an act that he did not perform so that he will be executed. At any rate, the disqualification of confessions ultimately a decree of the divine king.
Okay, it's amazing. Hundreds of years before modern criminologists and psychologists realized that even an uncoerced confession is not always reliable, Maimonides, the Rambam writes very clearly this is a precise point, and he says that there can be people that are mentally disturbed, that have mental illness that can cause them to mistakenly believe they committed a crime that they did not commit. There are people that are suicidal, self-harming, that could be trying to get themselves killed because they can, they hate their life, etc. And therefore, the Rambam writes hundreds of years before anyone in any other legal system realized this. Maimonides is explaining that Jewish law does not allow any form of confession. Forget about torture, even not torture. An uncoerced confession has no legal validity in the Jewish legal system. Yes.
Interesting that now we have this suicide by cop.
Yes.
So we have these crazy shooters that go kill 20 people so they can be famous and then killed. So
The concept of suicide by court, exactly.
The weapons are just different then. And the other thing that he did say though is
I want to stop you. You're 100% right. Human nature does not change. Just the methods change, but human nature doesn't change. And just like the end of people today that then courts kill people. So if you wanted to be killed and you don't have the guts to do it yourself, yeah, I confess this guy was killed a week ago. I confess to the crime. Hang me. Yeah.
He did. I'm not sure if the Hebrew translation is exact.
Which word?
And in the first paragraph it says, cannot execute a person or sentence him to receive corporal punishment, meaning you
lashes,
can't torture him or kill him, but it doesn't say that you can't imprison him based on. So in other words, you can't do harm to this irreparable harm to the person for this crime from his confession, but you can. It doesn't say you can't hold him in jail.
But weren't you at lesson 1? You were at lesson 1. Prison is not a Jewish concept. There is no prison in the Jewish legal system. You're not going to find anywhere in Jewish law says you can imprison or not imprison a person. It's not a Judaism does not believe in imprisonment at all. It goes against the very way God created the human being to be a productive member of society, as discussed in lesson 1. So for sure not, prison not going to be discussed. But here it's saying any criminal case, whether it's a death sentence or even something for which you would get lashes, you cannot believe the confession of a person that will for a crime. Okay? Now, we're going to get to the civil case in a second, is different, but I want to point out a duality in the Rambam's words. If you look at the text of the Maimonides, you may have noticed a duality. How does he start? How does Maimonides begin? It is a scriptural decree, that's correct. Meaning, there's no reason, without a reason. It's a scriptural decree. No reason. Then what does Maimonides do? He gives a reason. Right, you see? Yes, Carol? He starts by saying it's a scriptural decree, and then the next paragraph, perhaps he's mentally disturbed, or perhaps he's one of those embittered people which for death. We fear such a person may come and confess an act he did not perform. So the Rambam is giving a very logical, coherent explanation and reason why confessions are not accepted. And how does he end? To the decree of the divine king. So which one is it? Is it a scriptural decree, or is there a reason that we don't trust confession because a person could be mentally ill?
It is a scriptural decree, and he is explaining why maybe a scriptural decree.
Okay. Scriptural decrees don't need a reason. It's ultimately a decree of the divine king. It's like, the two people come to the rabbi, and the rabbi hears their argument, so he says to the first person, yes, you're right. And says to the second person, he hears the second argument, says, you're also right. So his wife that overhears from the kitchen, she comes and says, how could they both be right? Says his wife, you're also right.
What is a scriptural decree mean?
A decree of God that has no reason. A chayk means...
Yeah, but where? Torah, Talmud?
The Torah says, text 1a is a verse in the Bible. The Torah, the Bible says, in order to incriminate a person, you need 2 or 3 witnesses. Here is the scriptural decree that the only way to incriminate a person with witnesses. Self-confession will not count.
Okay, what if there are no witnesses?
Then you can't convict him in court.
In other words, if a man meets a woman and sees a woman and rapes and kills her and there's nobody around,
You cannot convict him in court. This is what we discussed in lesson 2 about the death sentence. The Torah has an unbelievably high standard of evidence in order to convict a person, an unbelievably high standard. And then we discussed the emergency laws in a time or in a place where these crimes are beginning to become too common and there's a problem. The rabbis are given the authority by the Torah to use their authority to impose the death sentence if possible. Although, as we discussed last week, ideally they should allow the non-Jewish courts to be the ones to do it, that Jews shouldn't do it, etc. But even then, you need witnesses. You need one witness. But last week we had cases. There was one witness and the second one didn't see the actual crime, etc. But you still needed very strong levels of evidence, yes?
Just point out one interesting point. Go back to that chart, 3-1.
Yeah.
Basic conviction of two witnesses. Yet eyewitness misidentification is 3 times more likely to cause a problem than a false.
That's an excellent point. It's an excellent point. Eyewitness misidentification is very high, and that's why you need to have 2 witnesses. One eyewitness in Jewish law, biblical law, is the exact same thing as no witness. Because Torah recognizes the inherent weakness of an eyewitness, one witness has absolutely no value. If you have 2 different people that saw the same thing, now it's much, much more likely that they're actually describing the reality of what happened, not a wrong perception. It could still be both wrong, it's possible, but it's much less likely. Yes?
So if they found a dead body with a bullet in it, nothing was being done about it because there were no witnesses.
That's last week's class.
There would be no attempt to find out who did it.
Of course, it's an attempt, but the Rambam writes last week, people saw the guy chasing someone else into a abandoned building, and he came out with his knife dripping blood, and they walked in, they saw him dead, but they didn't actually witness the crime, they can't convict him. That's last week. Right, we're going backwards. Let's go forwards. So, they're both right, as Kalakanda said, because the Rambam believes that, like all divine decrees, there is a logic behind the decree. There is a logic behind the decree. But the purpose of making it a decree is in order that people should recognize the reason why we're doing this is not because it makes sense, but because God said so. Which means that even when the reason is no longer applicable, the law still stands. Meaning, had this merely been a logical rule that the rabbi said, because we're afraid of mentally ill people coming and testifying false in order to get themselves killed by court, then yes, what happens if a guy comes, we know that he's very mentally stable and he loves life and he confesses, maybe his confession should be a good confession. But the Torah is saying it's a decree, means even in the case where you have no suspicion that this person would be mentally unstable or be looking to commit suicide, etc., the Torah decrees that a confession has no value for criminal cases, yes.
Okay, I'm going to field a little bit. This statement in Deuteronomy, that's a general Jewish statement. That's a statement for everything, including
No. So text number 2, yes, but the text, yes, we do need 2 witnesses for a ketubah, but the text of 1a is specifically referring to a criminal case.
Oh, it does. Okay.
Specifically referring to a criminal case. However, in a criminal case, text 2a, you want to read? Go, text 2a.
The confession of a litigant is as strong as the testimony of 100 witnesses.
And what is the logic behind that distinction? You can read text 2b as well, from the Radvaz.
Okay, it is possible to rationalize.
I mean, you understand? Civilly, if I confess that I owe you $100, my confession is as if there was 100 witnesses. It's 100% valid.
Okay.
Why is there this distinction?
It is possible to rationalize this somewhat. Our life does not belong to us, it belongs to Hashem. As the verse states, behold, life is mine. Accordingly, just as we are forbidden to kill ourselves, we are also not allowed to confess to having committed a capital offense. The same applies to any physical punishment. But our money does belong to us, and therefore the law is that the admission of a litigant is as strong as the testimony of 100 witnesses.
Connecting. Okay, we're back live. Okay, let me explain, then we'll take questions. So, what the Radvaz is explaining is as follows. When God gave you life, when you were born, your body was given to you on loan. You don't own your body. Your body is not yours. Your body belongs to God. And when you eventually die, you will return your body back to your maker. From earth you came, to earth you shall return. As a side note, this is why tattoos are not allowed in Judaism. This is why cremation is one of the most terrible things a Jew could ever do, because they are acts that signify, I don't believe my body belongs to God. Therefore, because your body is not yours, you cannot testify something which would cause your body to be hurt or mutilated or whipped with lashes or to be killed. You don't own your body to do that to your body. However, with civil cases, when we're talking about money, here, the money is yours. The money that God gives you is yours to do it as you please. So if you want to confess to owing $100 that you don't really owe because you want to give it away because you're mentally ill or because whatever reason, it's your money. You have the right to give it however you want. And therefore, your testimony regarding money is considered very valid because it's your money to do it as you wish. Your testimony concerning a criminal case that would impact your body, you don't have the right to testify about that. I'll do Mark Stevens, who was waiting before, and then I'll take Gary. Yeah.
Well, we have the same thing in modern law. We have criminal standards, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, and then we have a civil standard, which is preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah.
And so all we're saying here is that when you're dealing with a criminal case, the standard is higher than in the civil case, which is property and restitution. So, I even know why.
Say again, I missed what you said. The demanded evidence is higher in which case?
Criminal cases.
Of course it's higher.
Right. So I'm not sure why we're talking about a civil matter and of course about criminal justice.
It's just a comparison. The objective is not to talk about civil cases here. We're just comparing for 2 minutes, and we're going to go back to the criminal court. We're just comparing that confessions are not allowed is explicitly by criminal cases. By civil cases it is. Yes, Guy.
So
now we can talk about a civil case that also involves theft. We accidentally run over somebody and kill them. It's not just a matter of money. And if you admit, yeah, I was looking the other way and I hit this person. How does that feel?
In the American legal system, if you're convicted of a murder, not you, someone's convicted of murder, are they also liable to pay the damages to the family?
But that's a different issue.
Yes.
Yes. It's a different issue. They've caused harm to a body and they admit it. But what's a murder? No. But this
No.
doesn't say
In a murder case, I don't think there's a financial.
You took an wrongful death, that's the, it has to be in the presence of the family.
Right, but it's a separate, the civil cases, the criminal cases don't overlap. They're two different cases.
They can though, because it's like, it was brought up, the civil case, there's less of a standard, like the OJ case, he was acquitted criminally, but civilly he was shown to have caused the murder.
But they're two different courts of law, two different systems. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that in Jewish law, in criminal cases, there is no civil component. It's only a criminal case. If a person is found guilty of death, he's put to death. I believe that when there's two different punishments, you always get the more severe punishment. You don't get both. So if you're liable to death and you're liable to pay damages, you only get the death sentence. You don't also pay the damages. Yes.
You're saying that in Israel, for example, that if a crime is committed in Jerusalem, the police do not pick up the usual suspects?
You're saying today?
Yeah.
First of all, today's Israeli judicial system is not all based on Jewish law. We will think about it a little bit later at the end of the class. Okay? Yes? Clear? The main point that we want to take out from all of this is that in Jewish law, confessions are never ever used in convicting a person. So while the ancient and not so ancient world was using torture to coerce confessions, and even in American law till today, we're struggling with these questions. What exactly constitutes coercion? Is the read techniques and saying we have information we don't have, is that considered coercion or not? Jewish law has never had to wrestle with this question at all, because there is no criminal confessions. They're all automatically disqualified, which sometimes I hear people say that Torah is old-fashioned. And Torah is, is from the olden times and outdated. It's a total misconception based on a flawed understanding of the Torah, because Torah is, in fact, the Torah of life. Torah understands human nature better than any other person will ever understand it. And confessions is one example where the Torah was way ahead of anybody else and in its eternal relevance.
What the Torah is saying is that I can't self-incriminate.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And by the way, in the Miranda versus Arizona Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court Justice, Earl Warren, recognized the wisdom and the foresight of Jewish law in this area. He quotes Maimonides in his ruling, and he says clearly that the Jewish interpretation of the Bible is the root of the privilege against self-incrimination that is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. But what this Chief Justice did not get is that Torah actually goes much further than just protecting against torture confessions and giving a privilege against self-confession, but it disqualifies all confessions outright. So the whole case against Dassi is a non-starter, not even, okay? Now, by this point in this course, you should know this is not the end of the story. Why not? What have we learned in the last 2 weeks? What can the rabbi still do? Despite the biblical law, there's something called the emergency law. The emergency law. What's the emergency law? Where the rabbis are given the authority when they see a decline in the moral standard of society to go beyond what the Torah gives them the authority to do. Okay? So would confessions be acceptable under emergency law?
If the rabbi says so. No, because I can't incriminate myself. I still can't.
But what if, of course, under emergency law, we've already proven that under emergency law, rabbis can do things the Bible wouldn't allow. So last week, we quoted a response of a case from a rabbi called Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshet the Rivash, a 14th century Spanish scholar about capital cases. Now we're going to read another response of him regarding confessions. Text number 3. Jeffrey, you want to read? Text number 3.
Your question was whether or not it is advantageous to receive the suspect's confession. The letter of the law is that in capital cases, one can only be sentenced to death based on witness testimony, not one's own confession. Confession would have no impact whatsoever on the case. But nowadays, when we judge capital cases, it is based on the need of the time. We no longer have the Torah-based authority to judge capital cases, and our authority is premised on the allowance for courts to administer punishment even when strict Torah law would not sanction it. This allows us to rule on cases even without clear eyewitness testimony, so long as we have clear logical proof that the crime was committed.
Go on, our practice.
Is therefore to receive the offender's confession even in capital cases. This is done to enable us to discern the facts in the case from his words together with some supporting evidence, even if we do not have clear eyewitness testimony.
Okay, so the point is, thank you very much. What Rav Ashi is saying, Rabbi Yitzchak Mesheshet is saying that when you're functioning under the emergency provision of the needs of the time, so then the Jewish courts are given a little bit more leeway, as you said correctly, and you would be allowed to use, it doesn't disqualify all confessions, you would be allowed to use a confession on condition that, as other people said before, maybe Mark said before, I think, that there is other corroborating testimony, evidence as well. So confession alone will not be enough. But if you have other evidence and you know eyewitnesses, we would allow for a confession. What's the reason? Because when we're doing a emergency law, the rabbis are given more room in the letter of the law, but they still can't make up their own rules. They're still within the structure of Judaism, and they still have to follow the spirit of the law. So, as we learned last week, the Torah requires a very, very high standard of proof in order to convict criminals. And the Torah is focused on the welfare of the criminal and rehabilitating him and his atonement. But when there's a decline in society, we allow you to relax the standards, but only a little bit. We still want to do anything we can to ensure we don't get the wrong guy convicted. And therefore, and that's why the Rambam said before, remember the duality. It's a divine decree that we don't take confessions. It's not only a logical thing. The Torah is very careful. We shouldn't, by mistake, take the wrong guy. Okay, yes, question.
We have something the same in American law. We have the Fifth Amendment. You can't
self-incriminate.
Testify. However, you do not. If you have a defendant and you do not have to give him any warning, and you are allowed to question him if there is a continuing danger that you have to find out facts.
Yeah, that's something else. Like was a ticking time bomb. You're going like the ticking time bomb. Yeah, but that's not what we're talking about over here. That's something else.
That is a danger that is inherent, and therefore you're allowed to abrogate the rule itself.
Yes, but that's something else. It's the ticking time bomb. That's a whole other discussion. Okay, so seems that what we learned so far, we're good with confessions as long as there's supporting evidence, right? Wrong. Why not? So here's the problem with confessions. Most confessions that are given, let's say in the U.S., are not given completely voluntarily. They are solicited by the police with a combination of carrot and stick, where they say, we already know everything, and we're going to punish you to the full extent of the law. We're going to give you the death sentence if we convict you. But if you confess and you give us what we want to know, then we'll treat you with leniency. So these confessions are incentivized. They're not free, voluntary confessions. So the question is really, would the leeway of the rabbis under these emergency powers allow them to accept an incentivized confession? Now, you have to understand that in general, any kind of testimony that is biased and incentivized is forbidden across the board. Question is over here, we're talking about special circumstances, trying to prevent an increase in crime, an increase in murder, etc. Would we allow these incentivized confessions? So, to find the source in Jewish law, we're going to go to another area of Jewish law and see if we can trust confessions that are incentivized or forced, and see if we can extrapolate from there to our criminal judicial system. Some background to the next text. We know that in general, marriages only can be ended in one of two ways: divorce or death. Right? So the husband and wife died and the marriage is over. Now what happened in the olden days, people would go traveling, or there'd be wars. Husband will go out of town on a business trip and disappear. No one knew where he is. He was on a ship. The ship. No one's not today. Like you have, internet. You find things out. People didn't know what would happen, and he'll be a woman. On one hand, she wants to get remarried and continue her life. She doesn't want to be alone. But on the other hand, she can't get remarried because her husband maybe is still alive, right? So he's lost. We don't know what happened to him. He disappeared. What should we do? So the Torah tells us, normally you need a body to consider a woman that her husband is dead. You need an eyewitness that he died, or you need a body that he died, etc. But because of the circumstances, the rabbis would always try and find leniencies to allow her to get remarried. And so in this case, you would not need 2 eyewitnesses or a body. Other forms of witnesses would be allowed. Now we're going to read a case written by the answer written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, about a man who had gone missing. His name, true story, year 1532. His name is Naftali. He's a Jewish merchant from Sofia, which is modern day Bulgaria. He's traveling home to Belgrade, which is today's Serbia. He was carrying a large amount of money with him. He just come from a very, very big business deal. He's carrying a large amount of money on his possession coming back home. He's last seen leaving the city of Smerdevero, and after that, all trace of him is lost. Sometime later, the non-Jewish police arrest a gang of robbers, of bandits. And this gang confesses to a series of crimes, including the murder of a Jew that was traveling from Sofia to Belgrade, who matched the description of Naftali. He had money, he was the same height, whatever it is. They didn't know his name. So now this woman gets a confession from the non-Jewish police that this gang had murdered her husband, or someone that possibly could have been her husband. We don't know for a fact. There's no body to identify. He was already buried or whatever it is. There's no, etc. So can you rely on this confession extracted by non-Jewish authorities? And there was a big suspicion that the authorities had used a torture to extract the confession. That's how they did things back then. Can you rely on a tortured confession given to the non-Jewish authorities to allow this woman to assume that her husband has been murdered and allow her then to remarry?
Yes.
You say yes. Okay.
Did they have any of his money or jewels or clothing in their possession?
Obviously not, or else it would have been mentioned. You'll see in the answer, not.
So then I would say no.
What? This is clear. This was the only evidence they had about Naftali's death, was the testimony of these witnesses. And this wasn't right away after. This was sometime later they catch this group of murder, and they confessed a whole bunch of crimes they've done in the last, 5 years. I'm saying one of the crimes they confessed to was someone that matched the description of this guy.
They're not trying to convict this person on the confession. This is used by the wife to try and nullify the marriage.
That's correct. He's saying that it's a civil action. The court, the Jewish court, is not trying to put these criminals to death. They're trying to allow a woman to move on with her life and to get married, using this as proof that her husband was killed. So let's read, Barry. You want to read? Or Barry, text number 4.
You argue that we should be concerned about the possibility that the murderers confessed to something that they did not do because of the fear of torture. I believe that this is not a concern in our case. People are more prone to falsely confess if they are tortured and asked to confess the same so and so. In this case, a confession will spare them from more torture. But when a person is tortured and asked to confess everything he has done, he will not falsely confess the crimes he did not commit and continue to stand by his confession later. Such a confession will not spare him from torture. On the contrary, it will invite more torture in order to extract further confessions from him. Refusal to confess will be more likely to save him from torture. It has already been established that in our case, the murderers were not specifically asked to confess to killing this Jew and his companions. Rather, they were asked to confess all crimes they have committed. Therefore, even if the confession was obtained through torture, it can be believed. But had they not actually committed the crime, they would not have confessed to do it. In addition to the interrogator not mention they had been tortured, we should not automatically assume this was the case. We may have sweet talked them into confessing by telling them they would be pardoned if they confess all of their crimes. Interrogators often do this with suspects. Therefore, we can't accept testimony of these murderers.
Okay. There's two different things. Yes. Go ahead.
This is written that accepted testimony so this woman could get married.
Yes.
Okay, so.
Let me extrapolate what we can take. Yeah.
It might be the rabbi thought the woman was cute, or maybe he thought that maybe this.
What is there? The rabbi was probably married.
Maybe the woman, I don't mean, I'm being sarcastic. He felt really sorry for the woman, because she had a few children.
So let me extrapolate what we learned from the Rabbi Yosef Karazan. Let's discuss it.
He wasn't saying that those people should be put to death.
That's exactly what Stuart was just saying a minute ago. Exactly what he just said. The question is, so there's two different issues that Rabbi Yosef Kar is addressing in his answer if you read it carefully like a Talmudic scholar. One is the issue of torture. Number two is what was what specifically was the confession about? Was it a specific confession or a general confession? Meaning as follows. If he says two things. One, he says if the police would have come to these criminals and say, did you kill Naftali? So-and-so was missing. Did you shoot him? Did you kill him? And they would say yes. That confession would have no validity even to allow this woman to get remarried. Meaning, if the police would have gone, after she lost her husband, disappeared, they would have gone and arrested a gang of people that they suspected in general being troublemakers and said, did you kill this person? And they would have confessed to the crime. That confession would not be enough to allow her to get remarried. What happened in this circumstance was different. Here, they had caught them on a totally different crime. And then the criminals confessed to a whole bunch of crimes the police didn't know about, didn't ask them about, including one of them was the killing of Naftali. So in this case, their confession is a generalized confession. It was not specific to a specific crime. They weren't fed information that they confessed to. Yeah.
So this is standard police procedure. When they arrest somebody, they say they want to clear up a backlog of unsolved cases. What else did you do? And we still do that today. And in this case, since this...
So one second, let me stop you on that point. So if the police were to stop someone, and they catch him on whatever crime, and he, without them asking about a specific crime, says, yes, I also raped that girl 2 years ago, and they did whatever, then that confession might have validity. But it's different than when you're sitting in an interrogation room and they're saying, tell us what you did to whatever her name was, I forgot already, who shot her. That's not a generalized confession. That's a very, very specific confession. There's another thing that the Yosef Karo is saying over here, which is that even a general confession would not be good if we knew for a fact that they did torture. Since it's possible that they weren't torturing these people, they were trying just to get information out of them for other crimes. These guys were being put to death anyway. They were already caught there. So it could be that they were being nice to them and sweet-talking them. Therefore, we can accept, look at the last paragraph, therefore we can accept the testimony of these murderers. Meaning, there's two different conditions we need to allow the confession of a criminal to be counted as good testimony. Let's look at page 102, exercise number 1. You'll help me out with this. In the case of torture, according to our learning in Jewish law, is the testimony, the confession of that person that was said under torture considered reliable? No. Even if it was a general confession, not specific to a crime. No. Still not reliable. Still not reliable. Obviously, if it's specific to a crime, where they're torturing him to confess to what they want him to confess to, it's not reliable. Now, if they're sweet-talking him, and they're not asking for specific information on a specific case, they're saying, just tell us what other crimes you've done, and he on his own gives them information they didn't know, that they weren't expecting, they didn't ask him about, that would be reliable. But even then, if they're being sweet-talking him, and using, the way they're talking to him, etc., but they're asking for specific information about a specific case, would that be considered reliable?
No.
No, you understand?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now we can extrapolate that back to our discussion about in criminal law, that we can safely say that if this testimony would have been said specific to a case, would not have been considered enough to allow a woman to get remarried, how much more so we would not use that testimony to convict the person and give them the death sentence. Correct? Okay. So thus, even under emergency standards. So thus, Rabbi Karo would reject the Dasa confession out of hand without ever getting into the question if he was intellectually capable, if he was 17 or 18. Any confession can be the most mentally mature person in the world. Any confession where you're sitting in a room and they're interrogating you about a specific case, saying, what else did you do to her? How did you do it? Who shot her? Such a confession would absolutely never fly in any court of Jewish law, even under emergency thing, etc. Okay? So, some practical suggestions before we get to cooperating witnesses. Yeah?
Can I ask you
Sure.
something? Isn't that called meeting the witness?
That's what happens in the interrogation room. Right? Dennis, yes, that's what happens in interrogation.
Yeah, that's nothing to do with interrogating, interviewing a person. It's reading his court stuff.
No.
And even the defense attorney cross-examining somebody can read.
That's true. Every time you're being tethered, the lawyers they're trying to get you to go somewhere. Of course, that's yeah.
If this, the Jewish law is not the same as the Israeli state law, where is this set of laws?
It's not practiced today, really, because today there are no Jewish courts that practice criminal law. Today in America, if you had a civil dispute, we could go to the ORB based in, etc. We can have rabbis will settle our civil cases, but there is no Jewish court that does criminal cases. The Israeli Supreme Court. We're going to talk about it soon about the Israeli justice system, about this particular question. But in general, Israel does not claim to be a Torah-based society. Obviously, I think that it should be a Torah-based society, but they didn't ask my opinion. The founding fathers of Israel were very anti-religious, and so we'll leave that discussion at that. Just very, very quickly, let's review what we've learned so far. It's also on page 104, figure 3, 2. Under strict law, number 1, no criminal confessions are accepted. Correct? That being said, under emergency law, a voluntary confession, no torture involved. And we're going to listen to nothing specific. Where you have corroborating evidence would be acceptable. But, okay, and number 3 is that giving an incentive to make a confession, to sweet talk the criminal, would be allowed, but only where it's generalized. You cannot incentivize him to testify about a specific case, because again, he's biased. It has to be a general confession where he's just open on have you done any other crimes, and he on his own confesses. Okay? Now, does that mean that an incentivized witness is useless for a specific crime? Let's say you're looking for information on a specific crime, and you have a witness, and you incentivize them to testify. So their testimony is not allowed in court. It's not admissible in court, but there's still value. What's the value? What? It can lead you to more reliable forms of evidence. So there's still an advantage to incentivizing a witness to talk to the police, but it absolutely could not be entered into court as any kind of evidence in court. Okay? Good. Now, let's talk about the second questionable form of evidence used in courts today, which is cooperating witnesses, jailhouse informants, snitches, etc. In addition to the fact that usually these witnesses are not honest people, and they themselves have been convicted of crimes or are trying to avoid being convicted of crimes, or they're sitting in jail for other crimes, there's another big problem, a bigger problem with these testimonies. They're biased. They're talking about incentivized witness. The most incentivized witness you can ever find is a cooperating state witness that's trying to get immunity or trying to get a plea bargain, right? It doesn't get more incentivized than that. And as I said before, in general, it's an absolute clear rule in Judaism, biased testimony is not acceptable in the court. So the question is, how strict are we regarding an incentivized witness not to allow it? So we're going to read another case, text number 5. It's a halacha in the Talmud, a law in the Talmud, about a person, let's call him Reuven, Jack. Jack is in possession of a house. Along comes Joe, and Joe says, by the way, that house is really mine. But Joe has no deed to prove it. Now in Jewish law, there's something called a chazaka. Chazaka means that if Jack can prove that he's had possession of the house for 3 years undisputed, unless you have a clear document proving otherwise, that 3 years of undisputed ownership is enough to legally make the home belong to Jack. So Joe's coming to court, he's saying it's my home. So Jack brings witnesses that he's had possession of the home for 3 years. Who's his witnesses? Tenants that he's been renting the home out to, and they've been paying him rent for 3 years. So that's the proof of ownership, because they've been paying me rent. Can we accept the testimony of these tenants that are living in the home? Text 5. Dennis, you want to read text number 5?
Rava said, a possessor can establish presumptive ownership of a house if 2 witnesses come to testify. He rented the house from him and lived in it for 3 years, day and night. Rabbi Yamar said to Rabbi Ashi, these tenants should be disqualified as witnesses because they have an interest in their testimony. If they do not testify so and the current possessor loses ownership, they will be told, go and pay rent for the past 3 years to the legal owner. Rabbi Ashi replied to Rabbi Yamar, indeed, in such a scenario, only an ignorant judge would accept the testimony. The testimony of the tenants can only be considered reliable if they are still holding the unpaid rent for their 3 years of residence and are asking whom should we give it to.
You understand? If the landlord that they've been paying rent to lose ownership of the house, they're going to have a problem because now they're going to owe the new owner or the rightful owner 3 years of rent. Now, yes, they can go and sue the guy that defrauded them for the money back, but then go to court and fight this guy, So they're biased. So in the case where they're already paying rent to the landlord, they cannot be considered witnesses to testify that this guy has had possession of the home for the last 3 years. Even though they're probably saying the truth. But not probably, they are saying the truth. They know, they've been living there. But yet, they're considered biased. Only in a case where they have no bias, where the rent has not yet been paid. And tell me who to pay it to. I don't care. We'll pay it to whoever you say it to. Only in that case where there's no bias would we allow them to be able to testify in court. Shows you how unbelievably careful the Torah is not to allow any kind of testimony into court that could be considered biased and not honest testimony. How much more so this is regarding civil cases. Okay? How much more so regarding criminal cases, where we said before, the standard of evidence is even higher than any kind of incentivized witness that has a reason why they're testifying that will benefit them would absolutely have no validity in a court of Jewish law. Okay? And in fact, you look at text number 6, how Maimonides summarizes the laws. Stuart, do you want to read text number 6?
These matters depend on the assessment of the judges and the depth of the assessment. They must understand the legal principles, know how one thing leads to another, and carefully consider whether the witness will derive benefit from the testimony. Even if the benefit will come about in a distant, uncommon manner, they should not allow that person to testify.
Okay. Black and white, any kind of bias, even if it's a distant, eventual kind of benefit that will come to this person, his testimony cannot be allowed in court. Absolutely an informant that's getting some kind of plea bargain out of this. No way we can trust his testimony. Question will be, what about under emergency law? Can the rabbis, under emergency law, stretch the definition of what they're allowed to do and allow an incentivized witness to testify under emergency law? So, let us go look at the standards of testimony. Let's go back to the standards of testimony required for declaring a missing man dead, and let's see if we can extrapolate again. Another case. This case was written by a 16th century Polish rabbi whose name was Binyamin Solnik. He was discussing a person that had testified in court that he had seen so-and-so, a lady's husband, die or dead. He's testifying, a witness, an eyewitness who saw the man die. What's the problem? This witness was paid to give the testimony he's giving. They paid him to come testify. Can he be accepted? He has no gain. Can he be accepted? You want to read it? Can, right?
Yes.
Text number 7.
The agreement that Mr. Baruch made with the woman was that if his testimony successfully results in her being allowed to remarry, he will receive a certain sum of money. But if his testimony is not successful, they agreed that he will receive a smaller amount of money. Mr. Baruch is certainly
a biased witness in his testimony is disqualified by Torah.
Okay, so here, even to allow a woman to remarry, we would not accept the testimony of a witness that's being paid and getting some kind of incentive in return for his testimony. Again, how much more so in a criminal case where we're going to be putting a person to death or convicting someone of a crime, that there's absolutely no way that any court of Jewish law, even under emergency times, would ever allow a jailhouse informant or allow a person that's under a state plea deal to testify against somebody else. Okay? In light of all this, people have been asking about Israeli law. So, the Israeli chief rabbi, Avram Shapiro, was asked his opinion about the use of state witnesses in Israeli law. Should the Israeli judicial system allow cooperating witnesses to testify in Israeli modern-day court? They were asking for his opinion. I don't know about how it's done today. But this is what the chief rabbi of Israel wrote to the chief justices of Israel. Text number 8. Susan, you want to read?
Regarding your practical question about state witnesses, which is accepted in this country as a valid arrangement, Halacha negates this. The witness is biased. How can he be believed? It is true that the state has the power to make new regulations regarding criminal law, but this too has its limits. However, we need to consider whether the use of state witnesses should be completely banned. Perhaps we can distinguish between different crimes. Known criminals who are suspected of murder are a danger to the public, bordering on actual endangerment of life. Regarding such people, there is room to be lenient and accept the testimony of cooperating witnesses against them. But as a rule, we should distance ourselves from this path. It is, however, possible to make use of such a witness in order to uncover documents and evidence that only he knows about. But we cannot accept the words of these witnesses at face value.
Okay, so clearly, someone like Johnny, what we talked about last week, would never ever be accepted at all. We talked about the ticking time bomb, sort of, in the case of a person that we're afraid is still currently a threat to society. We can maybe ask for witnesses, and he talks later in that letter, in this response, about using their testimony to uncover more evidence, but not to allow them to actually stand on the witness stand and actually speak before the jury or the judge, etc. Okay, so let's sum up what we learned in all this class and some policy suggestions. Obviously, a person who's not credible can be trusted. No more, maybe, perhaps. Okay. So, in today's judicial system, a big part of what prosecutors use is either confessions, incriminating statements, or even more, cooperating witnesses, informants, etc. What Torah is suggesting, not suggesting, what Torah is telling us is that all of these testimonies that are biased cannot be used. All of these self-confessions cannot be used. So this would have major, major implications in the American judicial system. Major implications. It will make it much harder to solve crimes. It will make it much harder to prosecute crimes. It will make it harder to crack through the walls of silence that gangs and etc. that have around themselves. But at the same time, it'll be a big, big benefit to the American judicial system if we were to follow this kind of system. Because it would not totally, but it would to a great extent, it would eliminate many of the wrongful convictions that are based on false confessions and false testimony of biased witnesses. And by doing that, by making the judicial system not rely on the testimony of people that are to begin with not trustworthy in general, and are specifically not trustworthy because they're being incentivized to testify what it is that they think the prosecution wants them to tell them. So A, they're biased, A, they're not honest, but besides that, they're biased, they're incentivized, which in general invalidates you, and their testimony is not general testimony. They didn't come to the police and volunteer information about crimes that the police didn't know about. Police came to them and said, tell us who shot this person, tell us specific information that we want to hear. So this is totally not qualified, valid evidence. By removing this from our judicial system, it would in a tremendous way build public trust in the fairness of our justice system, especially in cases regarding confessions. A lot of publicity generated by stories of innocent people being coerced into confessing the things that they didn't do, especially in the African American community, where the rates of incarceration are so much higher, where they're right away assumed, at least they feel, perhaps they feel that their police assume them to be guilty because of their color. Famous cases like Central Park 5 and several other cases, which by making it harder to prove these cases would also make the trust that the public has in the judicial system to be greater. Okay, that's regarding the judicial system. You agree? No? Yes?
Oh, definitely, do away with a lot of the false confessions but at what cost? I mean, you do away with that, you better be prepared for the other side of the coin.
Which is more criminals getting away without being convicted.
Yes, and I'll let you decide whether or not that's it.
And so that's the discussion we had last week. About the last week's discussion was about the balance of being willing to say, the Rambam writes, I'll let 1,000 criminals go free than to convict one innocent person doesn't deserve to be convicted. Now, I want to end up with 2 points. Number one is that this exploration to how Judaism views confessions and incentivized witnesses shows us, number one, how far ahead of the times the Torah has always been. Thousands of years, before any other society recognized a problem in having a tortured confession, or they recognized a problem in having people confess or testify against their friends, etc., in order to protect themselves, and before hundreds of years before anyone recognized about the propensity of people that are not mentally stable to be trusted to give confessions that are not being fed to them, or to suicide by court, etc., the Torah had already eliminated all these problems in having confessions, and the Torah continues to be ahead of the curve and so much to teach in our modern justice system. That's one very important lesson. Number two is that when it comes to judging other people and to judging, etc., so we see how high the standard of proof is. Torah is not into judging people. Better to declare someone guilty innocent than declare someone innocent, saying now us, as judges of the people around us, not as criminal courts. Better to judge someone who's guilty, to judge them as innocent, to see the good in them, than vice versa. Sometimes we have to judge, but even when we have to judge someone, we have to judge with the highest standard of proof possible, without any kind of bias whatsoever. The moment that we have a bias against that person, we're incentivized against that person, we no longer are allowed to become the judges of others. Okay? That's the benefits of this. God willing, next week will be a very interesting discussion about post-prison or post the conviction. Now this person's a criminal, how do they re-enter society? How can they be rehabilitated? Do they have a right to privacy? These felons, etc., etc. God willing, next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.